When I was 9, I saw a skeleton on the cover of a very certain anime, and I immediately bought the first issue right there and then in the Barnes & Nobles. Now, I had never actually watched an anime, I'd never read a manga, I'd never been exposed to it. Growing up in the South, you just don't get really exposed to that kind of thing. However, now it's been about 10 years and I own over 30 Brook figures and a few Laboon plushies. I'm sadly the top tag for the word Calico Yorkie on most websites as a whole. I simply have always had a taste for Brook. To his false personality, to his mirroring behaviors, to his grief-stricken actions, he compelled me. His sad, wet, rat-eating energy absolutely compelled me. However, something that's not really discussed and has bothered me in the fandom space, and I've been here for about 10 years now, is that we don't discuss Brook before the room bars very often. His backstory as a whole has usually been glossed over, and when it has, it's been in odd fractured parts instead of being put together into anything coherent, often leaving out statements from the man himself, which bothered me enough to make this video. Now, I'm not saying I'm better than anyone, of course, I'm simply saying my autism has driven me to a point. Now, the most common talking point I hear with Brook's backstory is people saying that there simply aren't enough clues, that Brook hasn't said much himself, which simply isn't true. Oda's actually given us a lot of clues to work with, but these clues are often glossed over as simple filler or spaced out so far you might not even realize what Brook has said and what's been revealed. That's why, in the spirit of being horridly in love with him, I have, for the past 2 years, worked on compiling all of the references Brook has ever made using friends who both speak Japanese and can translate for me, and my own manga and TCB scans and any possible translational differences. In this video, and most of my videos, I am not going to be using the anime as a structure to build upon, because Toei will just change things. Actually, the point of the next video is talking about censorship and the changes that Toei has added and removed. Thriller Bark got a lot of it. In fact, half of it was axed, which is a huge shame. That will be its own video. I am only going to be discussing manga panels, manga statements by Oda himself, just to make sure I'm giving you the truth and only the truth. So with this in mind, I've compiled as much information as I can in chronological order, straight to the point, and at the end of this video, I've compiled a few theories. So let's begin with what is actually a fact and what is not a theory or an assumption, because there is a lot of assuming that you're gonna have to do with me. You're gonna have to hold on to that. However, we're gonna start with what we clearly know for a fact. And to begin with that, we're gonna have to start all at the beginning of meeting Brook, Thriller Bark. Now, something that's definitely worth noting about Brook, one of the first things I noticed and the first things that really comes to mind when I think about Brook, he's very evasive. I'm talking borderline creepy evasive. So much so that Frankie actually has to call him out on it much later in the chapters. However, when we're first introduced to him, especially at the dining table, he shows a few different odd interactions, but one that really sticks with me is when they're trying to get deeper information out of Brook. He has no problem about opening up to surface level stuff. Oh, my hair has strong roots, or oh, my name is Brook. But the minute they try to get anything out of him about what happened to him, oh, what happened to your shadow, he tries to avoid it, and he's horrendously good at avoiding it. He distracts you, he asks other questions, he beats around the bush. All of these things, again, are called out by Frankie, and funny enough, his response is beating around the bush again. Just leaving Frankie in the dark, leaving him with half an answer and in a completely different question, making it so Frankie goes off the rails and forgets what he genuinely asked Brook, or so he doesn't ask any further questions because Brook's gone on a different topic and he can't dredge it back up without it being really, really rude. Brook gets you in that kind of way where he'll give you a half-assed answer and kind of leave it with a question, therefore beating around the bush and making it seem like you've maybe moved topics or you can't ask again. He's never really been pinned down, and it's really, really hard to pin him down. I could go into a lot more about this, and I probably will in the next video, which is going to be covering Thriller Bark and all of the censorship and the arc as a whole, and what it means and why it matters, blah blah blah. That aside, Brook is very, very, very evasive, and the reason this matters is because trying to get his backstory out of him is like trying to open a bear trap, and that bear trap is covered in oil, and you are also being mauled by a bear. You're not getting it out of him unless he wants to tell you that. Or perhaps unless you really, really press him, which nobody has done so far, so we've only gotten a minute amount. However, the stuff that he does let go in Thriller Bark is enough to start to make a general picture. So to start off, Brook admits that he is 88 years old, having died 50 years ago, and then presumably dying at 38. However, again, we're just going off his word. Brook could have made up his backstory for us to feel bad for him. We don't know. He states that he is from the West Blue. Long ago, he was the leader of a battle convoy in a certain kingdom. Now, the reason that this is interesting, this certain kingdom, is that I'm not just saying it for fun. It is a bolded word. This word is not a kingdom or the kingdom, it is a certain kingdom. In the Japanese, it is also worded as a certain kingdom. An unknown, but a possible future event or a possible future place we visit. It is a certain peculiar kingdom. Now, we're not sure if Brook is born in this kingdom. However, it can be assumed due to seeing him as a child. Now, this fact should be taken with a grain of salt. However, Oda has drawn Brook and the other crew often as kids. We get to see them as children. This can be done during SBS, this can be on a cover story. It's usually in between chapters, but technically in canon, we have not yet seen Brook's childhood. However, we do get to see glimpses, if you count it as canon, in Oda's little in-between stories. Now with Nami, for example, we get to see her playing with Bellamere, playing with her sister, picking tangerines. With Sanji, it's cooking. With Jinbei, it's training. However, the interesting thing with Brook is that it's not always playing music, but it's fencing. We see him at a young age, wearing no tethers, unlike a lot of his crew members, shined shoes, having a full violin and bow, both waxed mind you, and playing soldier. We see him doing fencing moves, which he wouldn't have learned unless it was around him, or perhaps trained into him, which implies that this would probably be the same kingdom. He saw it at a young age. He got to see military training at a young age. He was exposed to it. Another thing that can be discerned is that he seems to have had money, or at least stability, which is a lot more than a lot of the other Straw Hats have had. The commonality between a lot of the Straw Hats, sadly, is poverty, losing a parental figure, or losing their home, or losing entire islands, places to live. With Brook, we don't really know what happened to him as a kid, but we do know the aftermath. He joined the military. Now, it doesn't have to be joined willingly, mind you. It could have been a draft. We see him play fencing, but we also see him play music, meaning maybe music was a hobby, maybe it was the career he wanted to go into. But either way, at the end of the day, probably around his teens to 20s, Brook joined his kingdom's military. Somewhere between being a child and being in the military, Brook was educated. Now, we don't know exactly what kind of education. It could have been military, could have been schooling, could have been knowledge. However, we do know that at some point in Brook's life, probably during the military or before, Brook confirms that he has been to school, which is interesting and will come into play a little bit later. But back to the military discussion, because this is very, very important. During Ryuma's fight, Brook mentions a few things. However, the major thing that we need to discuss right now, relating to the military, is while Ryuma has him down, Brook says the following: "You don't know anything about that move, so do not use that name. I used to serve in my kingdom's raider squad, the quick draw attack at which I was most skilled at, Requiem Lebentral. My comrades in arms renamed it with regard to my sword fighting technique, 3-pace humming notch slash." Now this brings us 3 really interesting facts about Brook. Number 1, Brook was in his raider squad, a kingdom's group of marauders. The Japanese says marauders, however it's the same technical thing. He was in the raider squad. Number 2, his techniques are unique to him, or at least specialized to a certain degree, because his comrades gave it a nickname. Now third of all, as expected with Brook's charismatic nature, he seems to have been really, really close to these men, which these are probably the men that he commanded over. He says in arms, meaning these men were either beside him or underneath him, which sadly adds another layer over Brook losing the Rimber Pirates, meaning because we know how the kingdom ended, he probably lost these men in the exact way, which is just salt over salt over salt over the wound. Brook has had an entire sea's worth of salt poured on him, and with his devil fruit in mind, it's probably extra painful. Now, for those who don't exactly know what a raider squad is, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a squadron that raid, pillage, take. However, what's really interesting about this is that this is not the only job Brook had in the military. Brook states himself, way later when joining the Straw Hats, he was part of a convoy leader for his kingdom. Now, for those who also don't know what a convoy is a group of vehicles, or people, usually traveling together for mutual support or protection. Usually a convoy is organized with armed defense, support, and can usually maintain cohesion within a unit. It's used sometimes in a non-military sense, however, mostly is, and in this case, absolutely is. So we know Brook had two jobs, being a convoy leader and in a raider squad. Now, before you go saying, oh, he did both of these at the same time, that's not what at all I'm saying. I think most likely, due to him saying these two very different jobs, he probably worked in raiding squads first, getting good at his moves, making friends, getting more popular enough to catch the king's eye. Brook would have been the perfect knight with both speed, charisma, and moves that most other men couldn't do. His size alone was a plus, and everything else was just an addition for the perfect convoy leader and the perfect accompaniment, probably to reveries, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Brook would have been perfect as well for a devil fruit. Now, the reason I say that he probably got his devil fruit here is because, simply put, the world did not know mainly about devil fruits. It was a treasure. The New World is full of them, and we've gotten used to seeing devil fruits left, right, and center. However, let's talk about early One Piece. Luffy was an absolute rarity on the seas at first. Way before we got to see other devil fruit users, he was the only one we saw. And it was a shock to see others later down the line. Knowing how rare it was then, picture how rare it was 50 years ago at sea. Pirates wouldn't simply have access to a devil fruit. If they're spoken about like a myth during modern times, 50 years ago they might not have even been spoken about at all, or known about. You would have had to have somebody who had it to even know about this thing, this mysterious, magical fruit. With Brook, however, his crew somewhat know about it. They actually ask Brook during their final moments after being poisoned and butchered, "Hey Brook, won't that devil fruit bring you back to life?" And he goes, simply put, and absolutely understandably, "I don't know, I haven't died yet." What's way more likely is, if you have a man who's meant to protect your king, a man that's commanding many, many other men, a convoy leader, a raider squad member, an invaluable part of your team, you'd want to give him a power that can both scare enemies and protect him, protect your king, and that would be the revive fruit. Picture the absolute fear if you were on the other lines and you have just killed the king's convoy leader, the man that is meant to protect him, and you're about to go for the king, and you're suddenly stabbed in the back by the man that you know you just killed, the man you just gave a delivering final blow to the head, and he simply stands back off, shrugs it, and just gets you right there. I would leave. I would never that king is safe as hell. That king is never being attacked by that kingdom ever again. It is an absolute both power play and strategic masterpiece of a move to give your squad member the revive fruit if you had it, which makes sense why Yorkie wouldn't have it. If they had found the fruit with the Roombar pirates, it's more likely that little redneck would probably be around and Brook would have died instead. With this information, knowing how important and practical and loved Brook was, it was very, very unlikely that they would have ever let him go. However, they did, or rather, Brook left on his own intuition, which is interesting. Brook did leave. It's not said why, exactly, and that alone is the crux of this video. Why would Brook leave? That is the biggest mystery of all, and that's what I'm aiming to solve here with a bit of theorizing at the end of this video. Why would Brook leave? Now, Brook has said himself he had a bounty of 33 million berries on his head. 33 million berries does not seem like a lot. During this time, for example, in Thriller Bark, Luffy had a bounty of 300 million. That is way more than Brook. Brook does not have a significant bounty, it seems at first. However, we have to take in inflation. Robin introduced this to us with Dory and Broggy recently, because right now where I'm recording this, it is the Elbaf arc, and we're getting the swing of shit, dude. Stuff is starting. Anyway, Brook's bounty with inflation is a whopping 300 million berries. Well, technically it's 297 million, but we're gonna round for this just to make a point. That is as much as Luffy. That is as much as the captain. That is as much as some of the supernovas. That is a massive bounty for just a pirate. However, it makes sense if perhaps somebody took Brook, or somebody wanted him back. If Brook was wanted back, you'd put a bounty that big on his head, especially if he was discovered, which at first, he didn't have a bounty. It was only after he was discovered to be a pirate after Yorkie passed that he got a bounty. Maybe a certain blonde stole a treasure from a kingdom that could never be replaced. Their convoy leader. That's a hell of a prize. Now I'm gonna rewind for 1 second and talk about something that may seem off topic, but it'll just heighten the subject. The elephant in the room, the very, very loud blonde elephant in the room, Calico Yorkie as a whole. Now, Calico Yorkie, as much as I love him, this is not a biased segment. I swear this is not bias. He is a very, very interesting pirate. He's seen briefly, only for a little bit, but he is a very odd bird in the pirate scheme of things. Yorkie, starting off, speaks in the Japanese in a very, very rural accent. He speaks like a redneck. He speaks like a cowboy. He speaks completely uneducated, and this is further backed up by the fact that Yorkie makes his crew read his bounties for him. Yorkie also makes Brook cook his dinner for him, which is insinuated using the SBS information. Picture using your vice captain for this shit, by the way. Crazy move. Crazy power move to do. Ah yes, Luffy and Zoro, where Zoro cooks Luffy dinner. The food Brook is best at making is a certain kind of steak, and in this panel here we see Yorkie eating just that, which is honestly really, really funny. I've not seen a vice do that for a captain before unless he's completely helpless or he just begs and cries and screams, which honestly, knowing Yorkie, it could be both. It's giving 60s housewife. He also seems to not be able to read music, or at least play an instrument, which is also very interesting and odd for a musician crew, for their captain not to just be a conductor, but to not be able to read music, play music, sing, do anything. He seems to just simply like music, which is bizarre for a pirate. It's interesting how much Yorkie relies on his crew for these kind of things. Very important things that a lot of his men can do, Yorkie can't. There is a larger issue with Yorkie, a larger thing that's more interesting than the fact that he only wanted large shirtless men on his crew, is his nature as a whole. He's a man that set out to sea to play music for orphans and crying children, as stated by himself. He's a crew made for any kind of person, any kind of man is welcome as long as they love music. Now, with this information in mind, and I might personally be reading too hard into it, however, due to his speech patterns, his want for a large family, and his singing to orphans, it seems like a very personal goal. What I'm getting at with this is Yorkie most likely was an orphan himself, which means that he had lofty dreams of making a family of his own for men like himself who were lost and didn't have a family, men that wanted to be musicians, a crew of partiers and drinkers and steak every night and just freedom. Which freedom, sadly, that he could not defend without Brook. But here's what's interesting knowing this. Knowing that he was an orphan, or even without him being one, compare these facts and this upbringing and this choice to Brook's life up until their meeting. A child who grew up being trained to fight, being around access to education, kingdom training, all of that, being a convoy leader. Why would a man like Brook join Yorkie? Now you may say it's only for music. That would make Brook a war deserter, and I don't think Oda would ever do that. Knowing how Oda treats the Straw Hats, being a war deserter stands out as a big, big crime compared to everybody else's backstories, and knowing how Brook acts, it was probably not choice. Rather, it was a choice to make out of desperation. It was probably not a selfish act. We see how Brook acts around his crew, how his men loved him. He probably didn't leave out of, I simply want to be a musician. It was more likely he didn't have any other option, and Yorkie was the closest thing. It would make sense why he would be under a man like Yorkie, not the captain. Now I have some information on why Brook would quit. That's the big crux here. Why would Brook want to quit a kingdom like that? Or rather, why would Brook have to quit a kingdom like that? Now, a very likely culprit, which is mentioned during Zoe to Whole Cake, and even some afterwards in Wano, is Germa.
Do you honestly think I don't know the horse has a dodge 65 hours into the game?
During Zoe and Whole Cake, a few mentions of Germa are made with Brook around, and these garner some really, really interesting responses from Brook. These relatives of his, they're the real key to all of this. Is it his father? His mother? At any rate, we know that they're in the North Blue, but then crossed over to the East Blue and now are in the New World. Pretty crazy stuff if you think about it. Finsmoke. I feel like I've heard that name before. I'm sorry, everyone. If only we had managed to hold him back at least, until everybody else came. Now, this doesn't seem like much at first. However, what's interesting here is Oda's choice of paneling. We have more characters than just Brook, Carrot, Usopp, and Robin. We have Nami and Frankie as well. And instead of giving Nami the panel that Brook sits in, instead, Oda chose to have her talk on the back. We only see her face there, which is a really interesting choice, because why would we need to see Brook's silence at this weird underlighting? Why do we need to know that he's chosen to be quiet? Now, this may read as just Brook listening or not knowing any information, but this is not true. In fact, Brook knows a lot and admits to knowing a lot more than anybody else on the crew. Reiju even pressing him on why he would know this, impressed that he knows so much. Here are 2 example panels. Vinsmoke. So that's Sanji's last name. That name sends a chill down my spine. No, it can't be. Later, when meeting Yanji, Brook states the following. Is that fellow floating? Germa's battle force. It utilizes science to fight. That's the power Mama wants. But Peckham's. Isn't Vinsmoke the name of a royal dynasty? A noble family that once conquered the North Blue with military might decades ago. What? It's that famous of a line? That's right. Our name was synonymous with evil at the time, and that's where we became models of the comic strip. You seem to know a lot about your history, Mr. Skeleton. Well, I've been alive a long time, and dead for that matter, but this isn't all in the past. We're still a royal line. A lot of the time, he seems to underplay or simply not elaborate on his kingdom, as if something maybe happened or the information simply shouldn't be shared. Anytime you try to press Brook, Brook is the type to simply not respond. As said before, you could ask Brook, hey, what color is the sky? And he'd ask, oh, can you tell me? If there is a way to get around a question, Brook will probably do it. Knowing this much about Germa, however, puts Brook in a very interesting situation. Now, knowing that Brook knows about God Knights as well, this is very, very interesting. Brook could have perhaps simply known about Judge and all of Vinsmoke through his time in the military convoy, accompanying the king to a reverie, and seeing the fact that they got disbanded and dispelled from the north. This is not commonly mentioned, enough to actually not be in the One Piece wiki. Judge was expelled from the North Blue, being the only other person to be expelled from a sea other than Lafayette, which we will talk about later. This would be the most light-hearted option. There is a second option, which we're going to get into in theorizing at the end of this video. However, because we're still going over the facts of the matter, I'm going to get back to his kingdom, because it's very important to know the type of kingdom that this would be involved in. What kingdom Germa might have taken over. What kingdom God Knights might have taken over. The kingdom possibilities are very interesting, and I'll list the most likely suspects. We have Tora, God Valley, Ilsia, and Soja. The most likely candidates, however, because, again, being labeled as a certain kingdom, is most likely Tora or Soja, if it is a kingdom that we even know. These are the only named kingdoms in the West Blue that are most likely. However, I'm going to lean into Tora, because of a very certain character named Byron. Byron is introduced during the Saba Odi, only seen once and very briefly during one panel. However, he left an impression on me because of his similarities to Brook. Let the auction begin. Entry number 1 from Tora in the West Blue. He's from a long line of musicians and can play any and all kinds of instruments. He's also a proud pirate. Give him an instrument and he'll play background music. Give him a mop and he'll clean. What's more is he's an expert winemaker. He's a 25-year-old human male in his prime. He's 6 foot 4 inches tall and weighs 286 pounds. His name is Byron. Let the bidding begin. Now, judging by his outfit alone, he is one of the few characters we see dressed like Brook, with a cravat and in a suit, and some tears in it, of course, due to just sheer abuse. He was also a pirate, the similarities being very, very clear in both his playing of music and his hometown in the West Blue, the island being Tora. Brook could easily come from this island. This would make sense, both being musicians, both wearing cravats. However, we aren't sure, and I am not the type of person to say for sure on just a hunch. My hunches are not fact. However, it's very interesting that we would have someone with so many similarities. I could also see Brook very well coming from God Valley, or the same kingdom as Fujitora, who by the way fled because of something he did not agree with, who literally blinded himself in both rage and disgust of what the military was doing, which could have very well played into a later theory of military takeover of this certain kingdom. We don't know for certain right now what kingdom it is. We don't know what made Brook quit. That is the point of this video, is trying to find out what exactly made him quit, because that is the missing piece of this giant puzzle that Oda has left us. Using what we know about the West Blue, which was a sea of war, it is one of the least known seas, with some of the fewest people coming from it, but everyone coming from it seeming to have seen great devastation and, of course, war, such as Shanks, such as Morley, such as Clover, such as Moria, such as Beiji Capone. There is an entire menagerie of characters who all have either had their island destroyed, have hate towards the government, or joined as a whole. We have characters like Fujitora blinding themselves because of the sheer devastation and disgust he had in the world government. Something happened in the West Blue to shake his faith. We have Professor Clover, who both died in the West Blue and as a young man, who by the way sporting fantastic revolutionary garb, had his brother killed in front of him for having D in the last name, meaning the world government was already searching for people in the West Blue, wanting to snuff out that knowledge, bombing O'Hara. Now why does this all matter about Brook? Where is this tangent going? Where this is going is the fact that what happened to Brook's kingdom was most likely a greater power, meaning not another pirate group that destroyed his kingdom, not some foreign evil thing that we don't know of. No, we know very well what could have happened to Brook's kingdom, and there are two possibilities that I've come up with. Now we're going to get into theory territory. My partner mentioned to me offhandedly one day when I was struggling with figuring out this missing piece, isn't Brook Austrian? Now, of course, we have to take this with a grain of salt. Oda said in an SBS, hey, if these people were real, this is where they'd be from, and Brook happened to be Austrian. But the interesting thing about this is that not a lot of the other characters both have roots to Austria and also use the language. All of Brook's attacks are either French, mostly French, because of the fencing moves and all of his fashion. However, some of them are Germanic. This puts a very sad, interesting tie between both Brook being Austrian and Germa 6-6. We know he dealt with them firsthand, and if it was not from the Reverie, it might have been from a very sad real-world equivalent. Taking place on March the 12th, 1938, Schwaltz took place, being the forceful taking of Austria by Nazi Germany. This was not opposed by nearby countries due to both fear and bias, and no aid was sent until much later when the damage had already been done and the kingdom had been ruined. Now, knowing how Oda mixes his history, such as Caesar being around the Unit 713 experiments and Che Guevara being Dragon, World War II and World War I are not off the table, for influence at least. And if Oda went this route, taking influence from this real-world event, twisting it into Brook's story and muddling it with his Austrian heritage, it would solve all the problems that have been left open. Brook perhaps lost his kingdom to Germa 6-6, facing heavy damages from their military, at least, but at most losing his entire kingdom, and the world government did nothing to help, simply letting this happen, excusing them of their actions and crimes, and just letting them still be a royal family, even if not going to the Reverie. They were, however, expelled from the North Blue, which makes sense for them to simply cross the sea with the accessibility and technology they had to just move to the West and terrorize the West. What's worse than being a pirate? Well, it's being a Nazi. Now with Germa introduced to us in this way, and Whole Cake as a whole, no pun intended, this puts a very interesting layer upon this arc. This isn't now just Sanji's arc, but the story of taking a knight who has already dealt with these issues and putting him back in the trenches, basically. We have just taken Peepaw and said, okay, Peepaw, you know how much you love your cook? He's the son of the people who did this to you. He's the son of your past that you thought you moved past. He is the son of Vinsmoke, Judge. And instead of taking it horribly, or taking it irrationally, or blaming Sanji, Brook stands up to an Emperor of the Sea without an ounce of care for his own consideration, for an ounce of care for his own backstory, without an ounce of fear in front of her, and states, Sanji is a kind man. I won't let you take him. Brook loves Sanji, not as a Vinsmoke, but as a crew member. And with this in mind, it makes Brook's PTSD episode near the end of the arc even more painful. Now, of course, because Toei has striked me before, I'm gonna have to remove the music. Picture like a fuck-ass instrumental going on right now.
It can't be true. Oh, Pedro. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Pedro really sacrificed himself. Damn it! No! No! This is all my fault! I was defeated too easily! I couldn't protect the Sunny myself! Pedro! I was so weak! Wait! No! I failed you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. If only I was stronger.
There's a lot of symbolism going on in this scene as a whole, from the Hirluk and Bellamere symbolism with the tangerines and the flag, and the crying Sunny, and cutting to the children who have lost their family in a very similar way. We see Kara grieving, and then we see Brook. Now, Brook takes this in a very different way than everybody else, and everybody's already grieving, but Brook takes it to an extreme, actually shocking some of the crew members. Now, he takes it understandably personally. He was very close with Pedro, but I don't think it was just closeness. Brook words it. Even though it was him and Chopper that quote-unquote failed Pedro, Brook says himself, "If only I. If only I. If only I." He repeats this over and over like a mantra, a hymn, a reminder to himself of the men that he's failed. Brook was put in charge, and he failed again. He failed in charge of the room bars. He failed as a convoy leader to protect his men. Now he's failed his family a third time. He falls into this area probably not just due to it being a similar situation, but a nearly traumatically identical situation where he's back protecting a kingdom. He's back protecting a prince, and in this case, he's fighting the Nazis all over again. It's an odd mix for Brook, but you've basically just thrown Peepaw back in the building again. That's not fun for Peepaw. Peepaw is taking it exactly how you'd expect. Awfully. Interestingly enough, the person who snaps Brook out of it is another knight, one of the sea.
Let's leave the weeping to our enemies, shall we?
As his name both implies, Jinbei acts as a comrade in arms, and not just a comrade in arms for Brook, but a helmsman for everyone else as well, guiding both hearts, mind, and the actual ship as their leader. He has to step in and do Fisher's role, Brook failing Yorkies and needing actual outside help. Now, this is not a common practice with Brook. Usually he isn't a captain, however, so it's uncertain if he would continue to act like this if put in leader positions, or if this is simply due to the environment around him. Now, this extra layer of whole cake, again no pun intended, would work very well with our first theory. However, something new has been brought to the table, which is where theory number 2 comes in. We now know that Brook knows what a god knight is, meaning that he is familiar with celestial dragons, which again could simply come from him being a reverie knight, being beside his king and seeing all the hubbub and things going on. However, something that doesn't involve pirates did take his kingdom, and knowing his revulsion towards this group of people, it might not have been Germa, but instead, something much higher. Something that still has its roots there. Something that killed the D's and turned a blind eye to all of the war crimes going on because they were the ones doing it. Brook's kingdom might have just simply been in the way of the world government. Simply been in the way of military might. Simply been in the way of celestial dragons. And when that kingdom cried for help, nobody came. At worst, perhaps, maybe there were other kingdoms before him, and that kingdom saw what had happened to the other kingdoms and instead of acting, simply sat idle. It reminds me of a quote by Martin Niemöller. "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Now, this doesn't have to be the case for Brook's backstory. It could have simply been the government, or Germa, or whomever, taking over his kingdom could have been the first. His kingdom could have been the first. However, knowing the West Blue, and knowing what we know now about the sheer history of the West Blue, and the fact that it's always seemed to be a sea of war, it's most unlikely that his was the first, nor the last, that was taken over this way. It's more likely, however, that Brook and his king bore witness to neighboring kingdoms be taken over this way. Or at least the king did, not to Brook's knowledge. However, the fact that Brook was his closest convoy leader, the thing that everyone looked up to, this bright and shining star, he probably did know to some degree, which does cast some gray area. But we know that Brook has changed a lot over the years. We can't hold this completely against him. And we know that he did not agree with it, because at the end of the day, after this takeover, after all of this had fallen to him, all of this weight had finally gotten to him, Brook turned to somebody that was most unlikely. Who would take him now? Who would take an ex-convoy leader? Who would take a person like him? Who would take him away from this? After his men had been murdered, after his king had fallen, this kingdom, his home is gone and ripped away from him, who would take you? But a little cowboy who's open to anybody, open to any family. As long as you love music, you're allowed to join. Take me with you. Take me to sea with you, most likely was said. Take me away from here. And just like Robin, just like most of the Straw Hats, Brook was taken in by Luffy. Luffy acts as the sun for Brook, Brook being his shadow, his knight. If Sanji and Zoro are the wings, Brook is the convoy leader following right behind his new king. Brook simply is still a knight, but he is also a pirate. He's the best of both worlds, and he's grown an entire worlds apart from where he once stood. But, looking back at his homeland, not a lot has changed. In fact, as the years grew into decades, even worse and more horrible events have happened in the West. God Valley took place there, meaning the Celestial Dragons had a choice on what sea to use, and which better than the unlawful, war-torn sea of the West. We have the Wild West and references to the Mafia of the real world, with Beji Capone and his 5 families of the West. We have the Island of Knowledge, O'Hara, bombed and its scholars charred and burned, with books saved to leave to Elbaf, which is interesting, again, because that is our current arc. Parallels are undeniable, and the fact that Oda keeps mentioning Brook's backstory in these small ways, more and more bits cropping up while Robin's revisiting her time on O'Hara in the form of Saul in the school, this seems very intentional. The overarching theme so far that has been present, I say so far because the arc is still ongoing, we still have no idea what King Harold's done to elicit such venom from Sommers, is the world government's desire to dumb down the populace and focus on the military might, which seems to have happened to Brook's kingdom. It's very likely that that military kingdom was taken over for that sole reason, making more government officials, making more soldiers for war, and Brook, understandably, would not stand for that. It's the most rational reason for becoming a sudden pirate. This makes the second theory, of course, the one involving some kind of world government, more and more likely, and the parallel coming from that being much more meaningful, especially to Robin's backstory. Having Brook bear witness to the God Knights take over another kingdom and attack the youth and the school to keep the giants in the dark and try to make mercenaries for their own needs is just another stab in the heart. It's throwing a log under the fire in his defense along with Robin and the Straw Hats of Elbaf. It's not just protecting it for the sake of the Straw Hats and the people, but also a personal grievance, a personal goal. It makes that fighting so much more important to Brook. Brook in his actions so far is still a knight. In his heart, he still acts like a knight, defending his crew as the shadow of the sun, of Luffy, having pledged his life to them countless times. However, he's still a pirate, defending his crew and his family's freedom along with them, as a crewmate. Brook's backstory will probably not be shown quite like Sanji's reprise, and I've heard a lot of people hope for that, but I highly doubt it, knowing Oda, knowing what time he has. However, it will probably be continuously mentioned, or honestly just plain revealed in a couple of chapters. My personal assumption, however, is that this will be a very quick backstory, a very brief thing made to complement a future chapter, probably also in Elbaf. It might even be a key part. Brook perhaps saying, oh, this is what happened to me, when finally pressed, by the way, I don't think he would just say this unless absolutely necessary. This is what happened to me. This is why I feel this way. I'm gonna help even greater now. It might even be a key plot point There's a lot of open space with this. There's a lot of theories that can come from this. Brook has a lot of potential in this arc. We should also be expecting a lot more from the West Blue. Oda's not forgotten about it, however a lot of people have. A lot of people don't think about the seas. When you think about One Piece, you're thinking of islands, you're not thinking of the seas and a community as a whole. However, knowing what we know now about the West Blue, I would keep a definite eye on it. There's a lot of interesting characters that have come from it, such as Lafayette, who was removed from the entire sea by the world government, most likely, not the community. The people there did not have the power to remove Lafayette. He would have had to be removed by the world government, which is honestly an impressive feat. Being removed from an entire sea takes some motivation. We have other Blackbeard pirates, such as Sanwan Wolf, who has not really been talked about, who hasn't done much yet, simply just get kicked in the head by Garp and thrown into the ocean. A lot of the most mysterious characters, Shanks included, come from the West, and there's a lot to learn about it. It seems to be the most mysterious sea. However, at the end of the day, it's still completely unknown. We can only make assumptions right now, but I feel like a lot more is about to be said, and a lot more is about to come to a head. The best we can do right now is keep an eye on the West Blue, and on Brook for that matter, who's a wealth of knowledge, and the sea he comes from is still hidden under the smoke of cannon fire and bodies, and Oda's general need for secrets. Now, this is my first video essay. This is probably maybe the first of a few if I have time, who knows? Maybe once I get a better mic that's not a tin can taped to candlesticks. These are just my thoughts, and I would love to hear everyone else's as well. Please comment. Please DM me. My Tumblr is right below. That's where usually all my thoughts go that are honestly a lot better written out than said aloud, because that gives me time to write a script. The next videos will probably have a script because they're a lot larger. The Thriller Bark video, again, is going to be a lot larger, so expect stuff like that. Expect a lot more Brook stuff because I love Brook. There is nothing more I like to talk about more than One Piece lore and Brook. Brook specifically, but One Piece lore is second. Just tell me. I would love to hear if I got anything wrong. Please let me know. Thank you again for listening. Thank you for coming to the end of this video. I'm going to leave you with this Brook clip that I can't post simply out of irrelevance. Expect Brook Part 2 very, very soon. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the moment you've all been waiting for, Mr. George Addison sings.
A pirate's life for me. All my friends are pirates and they sang the BBC. I got a jolly Roger, it's a black and white and fast. So get out of your skull and crossbones and I run it up your mast. With yo ho ho and a ha ha dee ha ha ho. Yo ho ho and a ha ha dee yo yo yo. I got a jolly Roger, it's a black and white and fast. So get out of your skull and crossbones, I run it up your mast. Altogether I like to be a pirate's life for me, and all my friends